Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donohue. Please excuse the nasty head cold and its effect on my voice here on this episode and our post-game podcast on Saturday night. Dealing with that right now. I know tis the season for a lot of folks in that regard. We're back on a Monday to break down Penn State's latest matchup, a 30-0 victory over the Maryland Terrapins, sends them to 8-2 on the road at Rutgers, wrapping up the road schedule in Big Ten play this Saturday in Piscataway, then back home for a matchup against Michigan State to finish out the regular season. If you've seen our bowl predictions, which Daniel Gallen puts together at Lions247.com, there's a lot to be excited about in terms of postseason possibilities. And right now, we'll dive into big picture and some takeaways from that matchup with Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan here on a Monday. As usual, we try to give Mark the first opportunity to share his thoughts because Daniel and I sit down out of the press box on Saturday night, and we'll talk about some of the details of the 30-0 win, Mark. But big picture, what was your strongest takeaway as you sat down and kind of digested this one Saturday night?
Yeah, I think a couple things. Number one, the fact that the pass rush was able to get home again for the second straight game. You're looking at 13 sacks in 2 games after Penn State had 17, I think it was, in the first 8 games. That, to me, was just really, really key. And I think it set the tone for that game early. Once they were able to get through and get those TFLs and sacks early in the game, you never really got the sense that Maryland was going to have anything for them. And then, listen, I know a lot of people aren't talking about Sean Clifford, and that's a good thing because I don't think he played particularly well, but he didn't make the killer mistakes. Once again, he relied on the weapons around him, and they took care of business. This time it was Nick Singleton. Brenton Strange did some good things. The offensive line played extremely well again, even though it's banged up. So those are my key takeaways. And then obviously I think the resiliency of this team, it's something, and I keep saying this, but I mentioned it in my preseason prediction that it was going to be key that somewhere along the way, this team was going to have to show that it had bounce back ability. And clearly this team does. I mean, obviously, you could look at one game and say, well, maybe, they just put it together against Indiana, but to come out and dominate the way they did against Maryland just spoke volumes. And the play to me that really jumped out in that game, Penn State 4th and 1 from the 27-yard line, handed off to Nick Singleton, and Maryland wanted no part of him. I mean, one guy tried to strip him 16 times. One guy couldn't catch up, and the rest of the defense just quit. At the end of that play, Sean Clifford was actually closer, who handed it off and ran a fake bootleg, and he just hustled down the field just in case because you never know what's going to happen. I mean, to me, when you do that to a team, that's pretty impressive stuff. And so Penn State clearly has bounced fully back from those two tough losses in 3 weeks. And I think, everything's there for them in terms of potentially getting to the New Year's Six bowl game. And I think it's pretty clear they're going to get to that 10-win plateau.
Well, a major topic of conversation for us as the podcast progressed and post-game Saturday, Daniel, was that we're now kind of bridging this gap between current success and enjoying current success if you're a Penn State fan, and also keeping your eye toward the future and seeing that future start to evolve in front of your eyes and letting your imagination really run wild about the capabilities of this program in 2023. A little bit of digging into this, Penn State started 5 players who were not with the program in 2021 against Maryland. Another guy, Chop Robinson, didn't start, but he had 2 sacks. Only 2 of those 6 players that I just referenced were actually taking practice reps with Penn State before August. And all of them, except Mitchell Tinsley at wide receiver, can come back next year. And I think that's one thing we talked about coming into the season, how much of this roster wasn't a part of the mix in practice terms until that first week of August. They were really light in a lot of areas, despite a big freshman early enrollment. And Daniel, that's what it's all about for me these next couple of weeks, because the matchups, what's happened at Michigan State and their spiral downward here during the 2022 season, and then what Rutgers brings to the table on an annual basis, not going to excite people. What excites people is those are your stepping stones to 10 wins. And along the way, we get 8 quarters to watch these guys continue their progress.
Definitely. I think also what you laid out in terms of the new pieces that have come in and been able to take on these big roles is that, excuse me, I think this is going to go down as a really good coaching job by the staff in terms of, we've already talked about what the offensive line has done and Phil Troutwine with all the different moving pieces there. But then you look at some of the other guys that you referenced with Chop Robinson coming in and getting to play significant snaps, getting rotated in. I think up and down the roster, there's just been really good examples of these new pieces coming in, guys that, didn't have a lot of practice reps to be able to be hitting their stride at this point in the season. I think reflects really well. And I think as you talk about the offseason and transfer portal and things like that, and even recruiting high schoolers, I think it can help make Penn State an appealing place to land. But given where we are in the year, the fact that coming into this year, I think I was the lowest on Penn State in terms of win total, and I'll wear that one at 8-4. They've exceeded my expectations. They, so far, there's still 2 games left. They've avoided that snowball. They've avoided laying an egg in a place where you don't really expect them to, or they really shouldn't, to be frank. So I think that they're in a good spot moving forward. I think that you get to the end of the year with 10 wins, you're able to take that step back. You're able to zoom back out and look at where we were a year ago, or where we were 2 years ago in November, what that felt like, what that looked like, and to see where we are in 2022 and what that might look like moving forward. I think that that's something that might not feel good right away when you think about that Michigan game, when you think about that Ohio State fourth quarter and kind of the what ifs with some of the sliding doors. But I think that Penn State is on a trajectory to kind of reestablish itself, in the Big Ten landscape, in the national landscape. And then going into the offseason, there should be some momentum. There should be something good for James Franklin and company to sell and put out there.
Mark, Daniel just mentioned good coaching jobs, and I think it was fair to wonder come mid-November 2022 what our conversations on this podcast would be like regarding Phil Trautwein. It could go one way or another. Now you're thinking, make sure this guy's a part of your staff next year and beyond. That's where it is because of the work they've done. We talked about this on the post-game podcast, but 2 games where you're in scramble mode over the course of day-to-day, you're wondering who's available for you come Saturday. You've got to piecing things together, those moving parts. 1 sack allowed combined against Indiana and Maryland, 428 rushing yards in those 2 games combined as well. Just curious to hear your thoughts on what has been proven through mid-November and really moving forward, because James Franklin won't talk about it, but how does James Franklin internalize what he has seen from his offensive line growth, because he has been pounding that drum ever since I started covering this team in 2017.
Yeah, you just ruined my joke. I was going to say I'm not going to discuss it until after the season, and maybe I'll. But obviously, I guess that was too clear. No, I mean, listen, you looked at the struggles of their offensive line through James Franklin's career, and you started to wonder what was kind of going on, because it was multiple coaches. And I think the fact that they showed some patience with Phil Trautwein, he obviously arrived at a very challenging time, and rather than just summarily making a big change again at that position, stick with a guy who showed some things at Boston College, who appears to have, well, he doesn't appear to have, he had good college experience, and he actually played in the NFL, and they stuck with him, and I think it's actually paying off. I also think you have to look at their recruiting. I mean, listen, I know there's been a lot of talk about the guys who haven't panned out. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the guys who are injured, the Nick Dawkins, those types of kids. But to be able to get a Drew Shelton and coach him up, part of it is that Drew Shelton obviously is a very good player, but part of it is coaching him up so he's ready to go when they needed him the most. I mean, that has been amazing. And then to bring a guy like Hunter Norzad in, and he fits right in, and you could use him at different spots. Bringing JB Nelson in from the JUCO ranks and getting him prepared to play. I mean, I think all of those things speak to very good coaching on that offensive line. I mean, I can't remember when they've had this kind of depth. It's been a long time. They haven't had it with Franklin. I mean, that's for sure. And that wasn't all his fault. Excuse me. I mean, when he first arrived here, due to the sanctions and due to the way that Bill O'Brien recruited, he kind of treated the roster like an NFL team, which you can't do. That's what we're learning here, right? That you have to recruit multiple offensive linemen every single year, because it's the most difficult position to gauge how somebody's going to project from a high school lineman to a college lineman. Somebody could just be big and dominating people in college. And then you have a guy like Olu who was big and probably dominating people, but he wasn't necessarily a 5-star. I think he was a 3-star. And now he's looked at as a first-round draft pick. So I think you look at all those things, recruiting, coaching, and it's kind of all come together at the perfect time. Having said all that, they really have to be knocking on wood right now and hoping that nobody else gets banged up, because they are really, really close to having to play some kids who I don't think are ready, kids who work really hard, some of these walk-ons, but I'm not sure that they're ready. So, hopefully a guy like Caden Wallace, he wasn't able to play the last couple games. Hopefully he rounds back into form later in the year. Not sure what's going to happen with Olu. It would be nice if we get a chance to see him, because I don't think we're going to see him after this year at this level. But I think it's just been an outstanding coaching job overall by Phil Troutwine and that entire group.
I'm not so sold on Olu working his way out of campus just yet. I want to see how these next few weeks sorted out. I think some genuinely sincere conversations are being had. And again, I think the fact that he is of that age, there's a lot of good, I should say, there's a lot of good intel coming his way. It seems like the voices that are important to him are voices that are looking out for him. And unfortunately, that's not always the case when you're talking about a guy who's in year 3 of his college career, reaching this juncture. The support system is in a really good spot here. So I think it's going to be a thorough discussion. I don't think it's going any way which the other or of yet, but whether he's there at Rutgers, whether he's there against Michigan State is a big question mark. And Caden Wallace was getting some reps at left tackle in pregame work last Saturday in Beaver Stadium. He did not play again, but something to note there. Speaking of tackle depth, and it's not going to affect them this season, but it's something that kind of follows a pattern of sorts, is Malik McNeil no longer with the program. And the pattern there is that offensive linemen, the numbers have not really been adding up in terms of getting production or really getting an opportunity to develop some of these guys of late. You lost Nate Bruce from your class last year. He was a 4-star prospect. He walked away from the program well before preseason camp. And then you had Malik McNeil, who, unlike Vega Ioane and unlike Drew Shelton, who have come in and really since the summer, we have heard they're going to make an impact this year. They could play if they need to. They might be in a position to burn their red shirt. It's always been, let's see what Malik McNeil looks like coming out of the 2023 season and where he's at in his progression there. We won't get to see that happen at Penn State. Still working on the why aspect of it, but no longer on the roster as of this Monday. Had not entered any games. He was listed on the travel roster for the Indiana matchup. It would have been his first game, I believe, attending on the road with this team. Instead, they took a couple freshman walk-on, Ian Harvey, Jim Fitzgerald. They both played against Indiana. And now a couple weeks later, no longer part of that equation. And when I talked about the pattern there, I don't want to make it seem like players leaving the program is the pattern. It's just that you didn't have Nate Bruce. Now you don't have Malik McNeil. So you're down to 2 scholarship freshmen in your class now. That's only 3 guys now who've come in and stuck with you through their freshman year in the last couple of cycles. And you mentioned a guy like Nick Dawkins, and you can throw Golden and Chumba in that conversation, and Ibrahim Traore. You hope that they can get on the right path here, but they're 3 years in, and Olu Fashion, who's the only guy from that 2020 class who's made a dent on the football field. So it's great that you got Hunter Norzad, JB Nelson, the supplemental pieces. We're only about, 8-9 weeks away from seeing Alex Birchmeyer, Anthony Donka, Javen Williams show up to the party and start to make their mark. But it feels like tackle in particular going to be a transfer portal situation to at least monitor, particularly if Olu Fashanu decides that he is ready to move on. But there's a lot of information there I just put out at tackle, but it's important because you see what it looks like when you have good tackle play, and Penn State hasn't had it consistently year to year, and that makes a big difference in what you can accomplish as a unit.
I think that goes back to what Mark was saying about when Bill O'Brien was here and needing to recruit so many offensive linemen to have a lot more bites at the apple instead of focusing in on smaller numbers. Because you look at these past couple of years, you brought in 3 scholarship freshmen. Now you're down to 2 for the class of 2022. You brought in 2 last year, and you had 1 after Nate Bruce left, leaving Landon Tangwall. And you look at that class of 2020. I mean, I think that's kind of the example of why you take so many different swings, because you need to have as many opportunities to find an Olu Fashanu, even to have someone like Jimmy Christ be able to be a depth piece, because you don't know what's going to happen with injuries. You don't know what's going to happen in terms of development. You don't know what's going to happen when guys get to campus. So I think that that kind of, those types of numbers, bringing them in. I know that there's roster management and scholarship allotment that also goes into that, with kind of, where your roster is at, other positions where you have, more depth, less depth. But I think that offensive line, more than probably any position on the roster, I think is the one where you just need to keep bringing guys in, because it could be the 3-star like Olu, who hits, the guy who, when we were talking to Keziah Izzard a couple weeks ago, who played in the same conference as him in Washington, D.C., was just kind of like, yeah, I don't really remember playing against him. He wasn't someone who really stood out to you. So I think that the more you guys you bring in, I think Phil Troutwine has kind of established the reputation now that he can develop these guys. I think that he's earned that, earn that respect. I think, given how Drew Shelton has done, what we've what we've seen from Olu, that sort of thing. So I think you want to keep bringing in these big guys, bring in these offensive linemen. Tackle, like Tyler said, I think is where you want to look in the transfer portal. But I think that as you move forward, just keep bringing in those offensive linemen every class, load up in the trenches, because that's where it all starts. You can't win without a good offensive line, no matter what you have elsewhere on the field.
And hey, Tyler, one thing that I don't think we've addressed, and it's just kind of dawning on me now, but when you talk about the transfer portal, all of a sudden, if you're a transfer offensive lineman, a guy who's played a lot of football, I mean, what better opportunity would you be looking for than to come to a program or go to a program that has Katron Allen and Nick Singleton and Drew Aller, and all of a sudden, offensive linemen who look like they're really being coached up to play at that next level. So it's going to be really interesting. They were able to get to, Eric Wilson. I don't know that he was a legit starting Big Ten quality. I think they really had to use him, and give him credit because he worked really hard and did a nice job doing what he can do. But Hunter Norzat, to me, is a legitimate Big Ten lineman, Big Ten quality lineman. You're able to get him even after you struggled the last couple of years. Imagine what they may be able to do with the talent that they have, and having seen this offensive line play so well, even with all the injuries.
And I will say, when you talk about the offensive line, a couple of things to note here is maybe there's some guys on this roster playing on the interior who we could see move out to the perimeter come next spring ball, come next August. Landon Tengwall is one of those we've certainly discussed in the past. Got to see where he is from a medical standpoint going into next spring, see if that's on the table again. We've seen him play tackle here at Penn State before. And then the other is J.B. Nelson, who played tackle at a high level for Lackawanna College a year ago, and then it was actually the top-rated tackle in our junior college rankings at 247 Sports, and has gotten some reps on the perimeter on the practice field. So things to keep in mind, because if you're talking about bringing guys in, we got to remind you there is not a single player on this current offensive line on scholarship who's out of eligibility when the season ends. So there's a lot of things to sort through. We spent, I think, solid 10 minutes almost on this offensive line, but they deserve it. Certainly some things as they try to continue development, and some of the conversations we've just had is about what happens after this year, but the sustained development, the sustained positive progress, very apparent. It is not against the meat of their schedule here, but they're doing it with a mix of guys who haven't played much football, and that's an odd and easy thing to do when you're getting ready for a matchup, and you got 3 padded practices to do that. Across the trenches, though, Mark, you alluded to this in your initial statement about this matchup, but they are piling up those TFLs and sacks at this point. The last couple of games combined, it's 25 total tackles for loss, 13 sacks. Been a huge explosion after we saw the defensive line get 2 total sacks for itself in the month of October. This is big for John Scott, because he's got a lot of these guys, and you look around who's doing it. Adiza Isaac, someone who's coming off a very serious injury, now looking the part more and flashing off that edge. Chop Robinson, only a sophomore, year number 1 as a defensive end, and Zane Durant starting to make some moves as a defensive tackle. You just look at the pieces, and again, what gets you excited is these are players who you're going to benefit from this progress, not just in November of 2022, but you believe as you try to reload in 2023.
Yeah, and it's crazy because the production just wasn't there for so much of this season, and now all of a sudden things are clicking. I think one of the real keys, obviously, is the last couple of opponents that have forced them to be in 2nd and long and 3rd and long situations. And once an opponent against Penn State gets into 3rd and long, you can forget about it, because you're bringing Chop, I mean, you're bringing Adisa Isaac, and then they're able to throw guys like Zane Durant and Hakeem Beeman, who are both really quick inside. And, where do you go? And then you start blitzing, Jair Brown or Abdul Carter, who is just ridiculously fast. I mean, the athleticism here is just really, really stood out. And I think that's a positive after the way that unit played against Michigan, especially. I thought it played better against Ohio State, even though it didn't rack up a ton of sacks. But against Michigan, they came out of that game with James Franklin saying they have to get much bigger. Well, yeah, I would agree that they probably do have to get a little bit bigger, but their speed is really showing these last couple games. And I think it's been really important. And in that game, I mean, you were talking about a quarterback who I don't think he was as mobile as he usually would be. I think that MCL was bothering him. But still, I mean, he's a quality quarterback to be able to get that home that often. And, I know there's talk about injuries, but there's injuries on both sides. It's something you really have to deal with at this point. So absolutely, it was a big bonus for those DNs to get home. But I also think don't overlook the job the D tackles are doing.
All of a sudden, you got 6 guys on this team with at least 3 sacks. You don't have anybody with more than 4 sacks. That's Shop Robinson, but those numbers starting to blow up a little bit here. Abdul Carter at 3.5 sacks on the season. Adisa Isaac up to 3, matching Denai Dennis Sutton, who's been at that mark for a while. And then, Daniel, I think it's just been so difficult to ignore what Abdul Carter has done. Nick Singleton did a couple very special things on the field Saturday night. I still think there's a case coming away from that matchup where you could point to number 11 being the most impressive freshman from start to finish. And that says a lot because Nick Singleton was the Big Ten Freshman of the Week.
Definitely. One more note I would make on the sack front in terms of the number of guys who have multiple sacks, the number of guys who have 3 sacks. Last year, that production was really tilted towards Arnold Ebiketie. I think he probably had about a third of Penn State's sack production last year. It was just, him. He was the only one consistently getting after it. There's a number in the game notes that went out today where 14 Penn State players have at least 1 sack, which is tied for the most in, I believe, FBS or Power 5. So among Power 5 teams. So I think that's something to note too, that, we were talking about it a little earlier where early in the season when Johnny Dixon is leading the team in sacks, that's a little alarming. When you talk about the pass rush, but now when you're looking at Johnny Dixon having, a couple sacks, now you can say, okay, the sacks are coming from everywhere. It's not just
I just looked it up.
1 or 2
I just
guys.
looked that up, Daniel. I looked up your stats because what did I say? It's 5 guys now with 3+ sacks on the season for Penn State. Last year they had Arnold Ebiketie with 9.5, and then 2 guys had 3. Curtis Jacobs and Smith Filbert. By the way, Smith Filbert had none in the regular season. So, yeah, I mean, when they finished the regular season last year, they had 2 guys that were at 3 sacks, and it was Curtis Jacobs literally at 3, and then Arnold Ebiketie with the first-team All-Big Ten kind of performance. So, great point there.
Yeah, and I think too a big thing is that I felt like last year they were around the quarterback a decent amount. I thought Jesse Luketa looked good coming off the edge, and it seemed like kind of like how we talked about Chop Robinson earlier this year, where he's around the ball, he's affecting the quarterback, even if it goes down as a quarterback hurry. But sacks are different. Sacks are big. It's kind of like, turning those hurries into sacks, turning PBUs into INTs. It makes a huge difference, even if, some coach speak might say, well, we were still affecting the play. We're still affecting the quarterback. There's a big difference, both tangibly in terms of yardage and also psychologically in getting those quarterbacks onto the ground. And I think that's been good for the Penn State defense this year. But going back to Abdul Carter, I mean, in thinking about, okay, who's going to be Big Ten Player of the Week or Freshman of the Week and game planning that out this morning, I mean, Nick Singleton had a great case because he did it in really highlight reel fashion. But in thinking back to the game, watching different sequences, I just thought that Abdul Carter was just kind of everywhere from the jump. He had the one play where he was chasing down Tunga Vailoa over to the sideline where he just closed the ground so fast. It looked like Tunga Vailoa might have the chance to make something happen. Maybe get back to the line of scrimmage, maybe get a few yards, maybe even find someone downfield if someone has kind of squirreled open during the scramble drill. But Abdul Carter just closed that gap so fast. Chop Robinson said that the twitchiness reminds him of Micah. It's a comparison that we've been hearing a lot for a while now, but as the season goes on, you start to embrace it a little more and more, because you never want to get too far ahead of yourself with a freshman. But through, you know, 10 games, but really even 9, because he had that early ejection at Purdue. I think Abdul Carter is definitely living up to the hype. And depending on what happens with Curtis Jacobs these next couple of weeks and his status, I think Abdul Carter has the position to really put up some big numbers and really close this 2022 season really strong and really be on the radar when it comes to freshman All-American, that sort of thing. Have his name in the the awards committee's mouths, like have him on their mind, which going into next year sets him up to be a really known entity and a really prominent player.
He trails only Chop Robinson in sacks on this team. He trails only Jair Brown in tackles on this team. And just to further accelerate that hype train a little bit here, Mark, I mentioned a little Micah there on that play that Daniel's talking about with when he punched out the ball. And you went a little bit further back with the number 11 that you brought up in the press box on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, I went with LeVar. I mean, and listen, it's again, nobody's saying he's Micah or LeVar yet, but we're seeing similar things. The closing speed is ridiculous. I mean, that Daniel talked about. I mean, that is what sets the great linebackers apart. That they are able to do things that it almost doesn't look like it's happening in real motion. It looks like they're in fast motion, and that is the stuff that LeVar did. And when we first saw Micah, I think one of them was one of the games at Rutgers where it was like, my God, look at this guy. I mean, that's these guys. I'm fairly certain James Franklin said that Abdul Carter is one of the fastest players on the team, including all players. And I believe that. I mean, I believe that. I never would have thought that could be true until I saw Micah Parsons and Jason Owe run what they ran. But these big guys now, some of them, I don't know what it is. They could just run that way. And he's a big kid. That's the thing. It's not as if he's a 210, 220 pounder. I mean, his ceiling's really high, and I'm not getting off the hype train. Why can't we have some fun hyping this kid? It's been really fun to watch him. And listen, also the fact that he produced in a game where your most experienced linebacker and your most versatile linebacker in Curtis Jacobs, wasn't able to play. I don't think you could say Curtis Jacobs is their best linebacker anymore, though. I don't think there's any question who the best linebacker on this team, and his name's Abdul Carter. And that's not a knock on Curtis Jacobs. It's that Abdul Carter is that good.
And that's interesting because I think back to some things I was hearing in August when Abdul Carter was really starting to show early signs of what he's become. And there were some people that said, just wait until that Ohio State game in that kind of a range, get this team into November. And basically the sentiment was he may be viewed as the best linebacker on the team. And when you see for the first few games, it's hard to believe because he's clearly a backup guy. But now, I said it on the postgame podcast, it feels like he's one of the 10 most valuable players on this entire roster right now. And I think what's so fun about this 8-2 versus a lot of different 8-2s that you could have in college football that this Penn State team could have. I know that there's the sense of so much familiarity with this 8-2 because you've got the head coach who's been here for almost a decade. You've got the quarterback who's been here for almost a decade. But you got these different faces. It feels like every game we're kind of debating which freshman performance was better. Was it the running backs? Was it the linebacker? Left tackle Drew Shelton stepping up and doing a phenomenal job for the last couple of games in Big Ten play in a big moment. And this all falls under the category of these are guys who are, it's always hard to guarantee anything in the NIL college football reality, but we're talking about guys that aren't just around for 2023. We're talking about guys that are around for 2024, and they're not just laying the foundation, they're taking the flag as members of this locker room. And that's why, to me, this November was going to be so important. And thus far, if you should be incredibly encouraged if you're a Penn State fan, no matter how hardly you want to cling to those losses to Ohio State and Michigan that were suffered in October. I think if you're looking forward right now as a Penn State fan, there's a lot to gravitate towards in a positive direction.
I think when you looked at this freshman class on paper, it really checked the boxes of that foundation where you have the quarterback, you have the running backs, you have the offensive linemen, Defensively, you have the edge rusher, you have the linebacker. Obviously, we have to wait and see at the positions where Penn State was already deep this year. Those defensive backs and the wide receivers, I think are kind of that's going to be the next group up that we really pay attention to this offseason in terms of comings and goings and which guys are able to take the steps to break into the rotation. But I think that you kind of, in your imagination, you kind of think, okay, these guys can be pretty good in 2023. That there's a couple guys who are going to make impacts in 2022. But it's one thing to kind of see that on, what was it, like December 15th, 2021, somewhere in there when it's signing day. And, signing day is, everyone's excited. No one's disappointed. It's, I think one of the most optimistic days of the year around the college football program. And so it's just totally wait and see. Hearing everything in the spring, over the summer, that's still wait and see, because you want to see it against Ohio State. You want to see it in Big Ten play, even if it's Maryland or Indiana. And the fact that we've seen that, I think that when you project things out, obviously there's no guarantees. And not just because of the transfer portal, just because of how football works. But I think that thinking about 2023, thinking about 2024, the forecast, the ceiling, I think it moves up a little bit. I think it's a little bit higher than it would have been 6 months ago from where we're sitting. So I think that this freshman class has really been able to come in and make an impact. And I think a guy like Abdul Carter is a really, really big part of that, because he wasn't the sure thing 5-star like someone like Nick Singleton was, where it's okay, he's coming in and he's going to make it happen. I mean, with an Abdul Carter, we were, I think all of us, no matter what we heard, we're like, okay, we want to see it. We want him to prove it. And he's definitely proven it. And I think that's just been really exciting to see, and kind of to see it. Like, we've actually seen the progression. We've actually seen him advance, him develop. I think that it really bodes well for the trajectory of him as a player, the defense as a whole, and in the biggest picture of the program.
And of course, really big picture, you've got the number 1 overall quarterback prospect by 247 Sports waiting in the wings to take the keys in just a matter of games. And that is the big elephant in the room when it comes to Drew Aller, who we didn't really just discuss in that conversation. I think the one area, if you're looking for more from, and you think if this clicks, it could really go a long way for this class and for the program, is that wide receiver room. We've seen some Amari Evans. It hasn't been consistent to this point, but we've seen him. Caden Saunders, Tyler Johnson, Anthony Ivy. There's a lot of guys in there that you say, can they end up being a playmaker on the field next year? And can they do it every game in, game out? That's the area I think for this freshman class we still have some questions about. But I think that they have the talent in that room to sort through, and someone's going to emerge, if not a couple guys. Mark, going to one of the oldest members of this team, really, Jake Pinniger, named Special Teams Player of the Week by the Big Ten. Guy's been dealing. He's 6 of 7 from 40+ on the season, and he was arguably the biggest question mark really in early September about what could stand in this team's way. We haven't seen him trot out there for a game-winning, game-tying field goal as time expires, but he's done all he can to win back the confidence of Penn State fans and his coaching staff.
Yeah, and it's been good to see. I mean, the thing that I really liked about him is that I think a lot of us almost assumed that he was going to take off last year when he wasn't named the starter. And I don't think anybody would have blamed him for doing that. But no, he stuck with it. And, he's been from everything we could tell through camp and, through the early part of the season, when we were maybe wondering, do they go to Sander? I mean, do they give him an opportunity because he clearly has a huge leg? The dynamic there just seemed really good. I mean, he seemed like he was a leader in that room and just doing all the right things. So it's pretty cool to see it work out for somebody who's been a real team guy like that. I mean, it's amazing to think he never had a 50-yard field goal at this level until that Indiana game. And I think even when he was trotted out there, a lot of us were like, what are they doing? I mean, why are they going to do this? Because, it was so windy. And I don't think even the greatest NFL kickers, I think it would have been a challenge. And you know what? He went out there and drilled it. And then he comes back and gets another shot against Maryland and does it again. It was funny because I was walking by his cubicle, his interview cubicle after the game, and I didn't get a chance to get over there. I don't know if either of you guys did, but I just overheard him saying something along the lines of, yeah, people have been questioning my leg strength. I don't know where that ever came from. Jake, it came from your numbers. You had never hit a 50-yard field goal, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, Tyler. I know you're good with these things, but his numbers from 40 and beyond were terrible. So
I got it. 10 of 19, because I felt like I was repeating it a lot back in September. I will say this, it didn't help him that he was kicking in practice alongside Jordan Stout for years, and then kicking alongside Sanders Sahadak, who we have no idea how good of a place kicker he is at the college level, but we know he has one hell of a boot in Sanders Sahadak.
Yeah, but my point being is that there were legitimate questions, but you know what? Mm-hmm. If he didn't look at it that way, great, because it allowed him to maintain his confidence. And again, I just think, listen, we're reporters, we're objective, but there are people you can root for, and somebody who stuck with it as long as that guy did. And when he could have put his head down, and he never did, he ended up redshirting last year. I didn't even you told me that. I mean, he qualified for a redshirt last year, very late in his career, and to come through at this point, I think it was really good to see. So yeah, he's a guy that I'm rooting for, and if he plays another year here, great. If not, I hope he does well. I hope he gets an opportunity at the next level. I don't know if he projects it to that level, but I'll be rooting for him if and when he attempts to do that.
Also, with his leg strength, I don't think it helped him either, where the special teams coordinator told everyone the line of demarcation where his numbers started to go down, and they had to go to the other guy.
Yeah. And so Pinniger aside, going back to those younger players one more time, we've discussed them so much, and they're going to carry the story, but there's some fascinating intrigue with guys like Jake Pinniger. He falls into the category with Bryce Effner, Juice Scruggs, Nick Tarburton. All these guys have dealt with adversity. They've come out the other side to be really important players for Penn State. I think you can argue maybe undervalued players for Penn State at this point in their career. They're all in year 5. They were part of that 2018 class that has gone in so many different directions, but they all can come back next year because of that COVID eligibility. Again, there's more names to that, but Jake Pinniger, Bryce Effner, who's been playing really well for them, especially this past week, Juice Scruggs, who has barely left the field as your starting center, and Nick Tarburton, who has started every game for you at defensive end, played a bunch of snaps. So something to keep in mind here as we enter the final stretch. It's just about the time where we're going to start throwing those questions towards athletes. Hey, have you given some thought to what you want to do? 99% of the time we're going to hear we're focused on 1-0. We're focused on trying to just have a great practice this afternoon. But we're getting toward that point in the year with some of these older guys. And to their credit, a lot of them are at a good spot in their career as they reach this decision. Daniel, I wanted to, before we finish up this episode, go back to the basketball court, because it feels like a really big week shaping up for Penn State. Non-conference play continues beginning Monday night in a matchup here in Bryce Jordan Center.
Penn State is going to play 4 games in the next 7 days. They're going to face Butler tonight in the Gavitt tip-off games, where they get a program out of the Big East. And then they're headed down to Charleston, South Carolina later this week, which I'm sure will be a nice little weather change of pace from Happy Valley. But they'll have 3 games in 4 days there, starting with Furman, which is a pretty pesky mid-major on Thursday morning. I think that's an 11:30 a.m. tip. And then from there, they could potentially play Virginia Tech. And then the other side of the bracket has South Carolina, has Colorado State, which was a tourney team last year. Davidson is in there, and I'm forgetting the 4th on the other side. But it's a good chance for Penn State to really showcase themselves on a national stage. Tonight's game is going to be on FS1. It's going to be their first nationally televised game of the year. After starting it on BTN Plus, which is about the opposite of being nationally televised. Yeah. So it's a really big opportunity because they're playing some really fun and exciting basketball, which the players themselves have acknowledged. Like, they know what this looks like. I think the coaching staff knows what it looks like to the outside, especially after how they played last year. And they're really giving themselves something to build on and really, something that people want to watch, something that people want to look at. I mean, we talked about the stars in game 1, Andrew Funk and Jalen Pickett combining for 45 points. I think they combined for, 8 points? Yeah, on 3 of 13 shooting against Loyola. You had guys like Cameron Winter stepping up. Miles Dredd continues to be good off the bench. It's just a really, really balanced team that's fun to watch. It can do a lot of different things. We're still trying to learn a lot about it. I think Mark can speak to what Kebajai looked like a little bit more against Loyola. But that's kind of the big question mark. But that's kind of what non-conference play is for. Penn State doesn't necessarily have the strongest non-conference slate, but it's one where they can make some things happen, get some wins that might age pretty well when it comes time to look at the resume, and they can just work these young guys in, get this 5-man freshman class experience, get these graduate transfers in there, get them experience, and potentially make some noise when Big Ten play rolls around.
Mark, you already told our listeners last week that when they get a chance to find Penn State basketball on a screen, to tune in to see Njai and what he can maybe do as an early force. And you spoke a lot about the early positivity when we were reviewing the first couple games toward the tail end of last week on this podcast. So I'm going to set you up with this one instead, Mark. What are your biggest concerns that Penn State can perhaps alleviate here over these next few games?
There's one that I don't know that they can alleviate is depth at the 5 spot. I mean, they're starting Caleb Dorsey, who works really hard and a tough player, but I think he may have trouble matching up with the bigger players from Michigan and Purdue. I think that there may be a challenge there. And I think you really have Kebajai, and then you have Demetrius. What's his last name, Daniel?
Lilly.
Lilly. Yeah. I'm sorry, Meach. Everybody's calling him, but he looks like I think he was banged up a little bit, and I think they're bringing him along real slowly. He's a big kid. I mean, 6'9", 6'10", and like 260. But I don't know that he's prepared to play at this level just yet. I think they may have to ease him in a little bit. So it's going to be imperative. And I actually. I thought they might start Keba. They, from what I understand, they started him in one of the secret scrimmages that they had, and he looked a little bit lost out there. So they decided to bring him off the bench. But he's 6'10", he's 240, he's athletic, he is ridiculously skilled. I mean, he made a play against Loyola that I don't think a lot of NBA players, big men, could make, where he got the ball on one block and he turned and fired to the opposite wing to Dalian Johnson for a 3-pointer. It's like, wow. I mean, to have that court awareness is just amazing. He has a really nice touch around the basket. I think he's 6 of 8. He's hit all but 1 or 2 of his free throws. He's leading the team in rebounding, even though he's only played 26 total minutes. He can shoot the 3. He hasn't done it yet, but he can do it. But foul trouble. So he got into foul trouble in the opener, and then he got into foul trouble in the first half against Loyola. But then in the second half, he came in, settled down a little bit, and was able to stay out of foul trouble. So I actually like that they're starting Dorsey, because it's allowing this kid to come in and kind of ease his way in. Well, not ease his way in, but not being dependent on right off the jump. So he's able to come in and do what he does. And as you watch him, watch for the little skill things that I'm talking about. His athletic ability is great. His size is terrific. He has really big legs for a kid his size. And I think as his upper body builds out, that's where people are looking at him as being an NBA prospect. But his skill, his feel for the game, his ability to pass, they work him off the high post a lot. Very comfortable out there with the ball, where he's getting the ball, setting screens, firing it around. I'm excited about him, as you could tell. They have some other really good new players. I mean, Funk is legit. They used him more as a decoy against Loyola, but he's got a quick release. Cameron Winter has been a really nice addition. He looked a little shaky in the first game, but found his footing in the most recent game. And I just think overall, they have a real nice group of players, but that depth in the front court. And I don't know that it's necessarily going to show itself until we get into the Big Ten. The game tonight, we're taping this Monday. They have a big kid who transferred from North Carolina State, who I think is 6'10", 6'11", and 260. But I think he's their one really big guy, and you could kind of deal with that. But when you're dealing with a bunch of these guys against some of these Big Ten programs, that's going to be an issue.
Penn State basketball back in action on Monday night against Butler. Full coverage at Lions247.com. Really enjoyed the basketball coverage from you guys so far this season. 2 wins in 2 games and 1 vote in the AP Top 25 poll. So got to start somewhere, and that's where you are right now if you're the Nittany Lions when it comes to national rankings. We'll be back with another episode Tuesday, coming to you after James Franklin's press conference. By then, we'll have spoken with some Nittany Lions players as well as game week number 11 gets underway. Rutgers on the map on Saturday. We'll talk about that matchup a little bit more later in the week as well, get some perspective on the Scarlet Knights. Recruiting, a lot going on coming out of the weekend, both in basketball and football. Tyler Calvaruzzo has you covered with a bunch up at Lions247.com. Our VIP subscribers already in the know on how things are trending. Some 2023 movement to monitor here as we get a little bit closer toward early signing day. For Daniel and Mark and everyone at the Lions 24/7 team, I'm Tyler Donohue. This has been the Lions 24/7 Podcast.